And if you have questions for Carla that come up during the presentation, you can put them in the chat here on Zoom or also in the comments on Facebook if you're following along there, and we'll ask her the questions at the end during the Q&A time. So are we ready, Robin?
Does not seem to be going. I don't see it on I don't see it on the page.
Did you, and you made sure to share it to the page?
Yeah, and remember the reason we had you doing it is because it never seemed to work for me.
Oh, it's working. It's there. I can
Is
see
it there?
it.
Okay,
yeah.
good. Okay.
Okay. So everybody gets to hear us, you know, in our little, what are we doing?
Well, yeah,
fine.
that
We're
we
good.
had
It's just,
okay. We had
we are real.
Okay.
Okay, let's get started. So I'm Terry Camerzell here on behalf of Creation Fellowship Santee, and we're a group of friends that are bound by our common agreement that the book of Genesis is a true depiction of how God created the earth and all life in just 6 days, a few thousand years ago. We've been meeting on Zoom here most Thursday nights since June of 2020, and we've been blessed with presentations by pastors, teachers, missionaries, scientists, doctors, cartoonists, and all around smarty pants people who love the Lord and have a message to share. You can find most of our past videos by searching for Creation Fellowship Santee, that's SANTEE on YouTube. You can also find our new Rumble account by looking for CFS 2020, and we're also on BitChute now. You can like and follow our Creation Fellowship Santee Facebook page, and you can sign up for our email list, which is just the upcoming speakers each week, by emailing creationfellowshipsantee@gmail.com. Tonight, we're blessed to have Carla Estell presenting with us. She has a presentation called Revisiting the Ice Age. And Carla is a 1987 Liberty University graduate. She classroom taught for 6 years and homeschooled for 21. In 1998, she and her husband, Brian, began a part-time creation ministry called The Stone's True Story, which focuses on the truth of God's word. They and their 6 children have traveled through 48 states, visiting many geological sites, collecting fossils and sharing at camps, schools, and churches. In 2016, they relocated to Illinois, where Brian is a representative of Samaritan Ministries, and Carla continues to homeschool and teach science at the New Castle Homeschool Co-op. So with that, Carla, we're turning it over to you.
All right. So I share my screen, right?
Yes.
Okay, and then my PowerPoint. All right, so just a minute slideshow from the beginning.
You have to share your screen and then click share again, because we don't see your screen yet.
You don't see my screen?
No.
Okay. All right, hold on just a minute. Now I have to figure out how to get out of my slideshow.
I think if you just hit your Windows key, you'll see.
Okay. So share computer sound.
Make sure that's off, and
Okay,
also the optimize is off.
Okay.
Yeah, just hit share, and it should be in blue down on the right.
Oh, share.
There we go.
All right, yeah. And we practiced this already, but that's okay.
All and right. Then you're gonna want to maximize. There you go.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then from the beginning.
There you go. We
Is
are
that
good
all
to
set?
go. Yes.
All right,
good job.
Very good. All right. Thank you. All right. So this, first off, just to let you know up front that this is going to be a lot of new stuff, and it's going to be like drinking from a fire hydrant because it's a lot of information. But I'm asking the question, is some evidence of the global flood being misinterpreted as the Ice Age? Now, for 20 years, I've taught that the Ice Age followed the flood. This is a slide I put together for our kids program explaining how the flood caused an Ice Age. And then this is a diorama I've made. It's part of our hands-on portable museum. and it shows the dispersal of the nations after the Tower of Babel. And as you can see up in the corner, it includes the cave in the Ice Age time. And then it even made it into our song. We have an 11-verse song that we do with the kids program. And it's, although great ice sheets covered the north, that's still where some folks ventured forth. They lived in caves, made their own tools, but that didn't make them anyone's fools. They were human, fully human, surviving in a harsh frozen land. So I was well versed with the Ice Age. I could explain it very well, why it happened and whatnot. But then we sold our home and started driving coast to coast, sharing at different schools, churches, camps, and talking with different people along the way. And some of the different things that I saw along the way, I started questioning different aspects of the Ice Age. So that's what I want to share with you tonight. So one of the things we saw was going through Minnesota. We had traveled quite a bit in the past. Each summer we usually took a trip, but this was my first time in Minnesota. And going through and seeing all the hills and the ponds that just dot the area there. And as we were driving through this area, this is an aerial map at the museum that's right near the start of the Mississippi River. So you can see on here all the little hills and all the ponds that just cover this area of Minnesota. But I was reminded of some miniature kettle ponds that we had seen a month earlier. Notice how steep the hill is, and then the pond there at the base. There's another one. And this is a whole area dotted with the hills and the ponds, just like Minnesota, except in miniature. But these ponds are just 30 years old. This is at Mount St. Helens. And this is the area where the landslide came and filled the valley. And as the landslide was rushing in, it caused all of these little hills here, just from the energy of the dirt sliding through. As you know, if you've ever watched in a river and the river is flowing very fast, there'll be lots of little waves, the energy waves. And that's what you see here. But where the ponds came from was all the ice that was carried with the dirt and then buried. And when the ice later melted, you have the ponds. Now, here's another thing that they usually say is an ice age is when you have a boulder field, like this field here, because the glaciers come along, they're carrying all these rocks and boulders. And then when the glaciers melt, the boulders drop out and you're left with the boulder field. However, this is not from glacier. This is from a mud flow. This is also at Mount St. Helens, and this is the backside, the south side of the volcano. While the volcano was erupting, all the snow and ice on the backside was melting, and it was sliding off the volcano, rushing through this area, going 40 miles per hour. It uprooted all the forest, and it dropped these boulders in its path. There's my favorite one. But this was rounded and transported in just one day. Now, if a glacier, it takes hundreds of years to do the different things that a glacier can do. With a mud flow, it happens very, very quickly. And the same mud flow that transported this boulder also came through and carved this canyon. You can see the boulder sitting there at the edge of the canyon. So this canyon was made not by an ice age, not by a glacier, but by a mud flow in one day. There you can see another view of it. So I got to thinking, couldn't other canyons have been carved by mud flows and not glaciers? When you notice the rounded rock, that's the sign that usually they say is a glacier. When we've seen stuff like this up in Connecticut and Vermont, there's always a sign talking about a slow moving glacier coming through and carving the canyon. Here's some other glacier grooves. But again, I got wondering, could this not have been rushing water that sculpted the earth instead of a slow moving glacier? But why do people assume that these, especially here, were made by a glacier? It's because of their location. That's on Kelly Island, right in the middle of Lake Erie, or at the edge of Lake Erie. But could not this channel have been carved by the draining of the sea after the flood? The area was obviously covered by the sea. And this is what really surprised me, was all the coral that we found. Now, Kelly Island is just an island made of lime rock, layer upon layer upon layer of lime rock. And here at this top surface of it, you find all of this coral embedded in the lime rock. So that got me wondering, how do you go from coral growth to glaciers? I asked myself and anyone else who would listen, what was coral doing in Ohio, Michigan, Upper New York? We also found it. It's in Canada, but we've not been up there yet. So why is it growing so far north? And when did it grow? Then we moved to Michigan. Now, after 2.5 years of being on the road and living in the camper, our 6 children grew quite a bit. The boys outgrew their bunks in the back of the camper. Our oldest son started saying, this isn't the camper, this is the cramper. So we started looking for a new home base, and one opened up in Michigan. It was a parsonage of a church. And so we still were full-time, but we would go out on a loop and we'd have a home to come back to for a few months. Then we would go out on a loop again. So when we moved to Michigan, it was right near Christmas. And we did not see the ground again until April. That was the first time I had ever experienced a true winter. And it got me wondering, if the flood lasted for an entire year, wasn't there a winter during the flood? And with that thought in the back of my head, we went and toured the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. And at one of the museums up there, I saw this relief map. And I stood there and stared at this relief map, I don't know for how long, wondering how in the world could glaciers have carved the Great Lakes? Now, Lake Erie, yeah, it's a shallow lake. It looks like a glacier could come right through there and carve it out, except that it's kind of going in the wrong direction. But especially Lake Superior. Look at the bottom of Lake Superior. How in the world could a glacier have carved that? And then another interesting thing about the Great Lakes, especially, let's see, that Great Lake that's there by Michigan, not the Lake Michigan, but the other side, and I can't remember the name of it, but it actually has huge salt beds under the Great Lake. How in the world do you have salt beds and then a freshwater lake sitting on top of it? Then I got to thinking about what the bottom of that lake really looks like. And to me, it looks like huge glaciers just sat there and sank into the mud. So I got wondering if it beached icebergs could, I'm sorry, I said glaciers and I meant to say icebergs. I got wondering if beached icebergs could have formed the freshwater lake. And as the water drained off, the icebergs were beached, and the weight of the iceberg would have broke that surface lava, which is what you have there. All along Lake Superior especially, you can see the layers of lava that have been broken. And then as the ice sank into that softer sediment that's beneath the lava, the displaced sediment would form hills up all around the lake, which is exactly what you see as little hills. And then when the icebergs melted, the runoff flowed to the sea, connecting all the lakes and carving shallow Lake Erie. So anyway, it's just kind of a different idea, but there's a picture of it that's easier to see. So at the top, we see the waters of the flood, and icebergs have formed. As the water's draining off, the iceberg just sits and sinks down into that soft sediment that forms up into the hills. And then it melts and you have freshwater lake. And then I remember those kettle ponds in Minnesota. Could they also be from beached ice? just like those kettle ponds at Mount St. Helens. We know that Mount St. Helens formed from melted ice that was buried there in the sediment. So the force of the water draining off the land and back into the sea also could easily have eroded through and relayed the sediment that was laid during the flood. So here you can see at the top picture, that's before the drain off happened. The bottom pictures where the Canadian Shield is being lifted up and the sediment in the water is draining off. There you can see it again, going from the north to the south. So a lot of people think that the Canadian Shield just never had very much sediment on it and that it was always high. I personally believe that the Canadian Shield had just as much sediment as anywhere else, but when it was lifted up, the sediment rushed off. And if you look at this, here's a map of the Canadian Shield. It is huge. And then here's a map showing where there's like double sediment. So this is the prairie areas. So as this Canadian Shield was lifted up, all the sediment went rushing off along with the water, forming this double sediment here where you see in red. And what hemmed it in was the mountain ranges. So if the mountains were raised first, then the Canadian Shield, and then all the sediment was kind of trapped right there. And then if you notice where the Great Lakes are, they're sitting right at the edge where the Canadian Shield and the sediment meet. So if there were a lot of ice that had been forming up there that rushed off with the water, that's where it would get lodged and that's where it would sit. But there's not just freshwater lakes right there. They're all along the Shield. So also in our travels, we saw a lot of fossil beds. I would search them out on the map, and if we were anywhere close, we would take a side trip and go see them. So this is one, Mammoth Hot Springs in South Dakota. Notice here on this one how you have several layers of fossils. The deeper they dig, the more fossils they find. They say this area was a spring, and the animals fell into the spring. They got trapped, they got bogged, they died, and they turned into fossils. Meanwhile, more and more animals kept falling into the spring. Here's Ashfall Park. This is in Nebraska. And here it's kind of just one flat layer of fossils, and they're covered with ash. So the idea was more of the volcanic ash killed and suffocated the animals, buried them, and then they became fossils. But yet, in the seminars and teaching how are fossils made, we tell kids that, well, to make a fossil, you have to bury it quick and you have to bury it deep and you have to bury it in a lot of wet mud. Because the wet mud, the water will seep into the bone, carrying the silica with it and turn the fossil into stone. And you have to bury it quick before it can rot away and deep before it can be scavenged. But this area here, this is like right on the surface, not buried very deeply or quickly at all. So how did fossils form here on the dry land? And then we went to Agate Fossil Bed. And this, they had a really unusual story here. Here it was more like comparing it to Africa, where you have a drought and the animals all gather around the watering hole, and then the water dries up and the animals all die. So you have all these dead animals and then they turn into fossils. But I don't know that fossils are forming in Africa around the dried up water holes. I do believe they're getting scavenged and rotting away. So that's not really the best explanation of how you can form these fossils, because to make a fossil, you have to bury it quick and deep in a lot of wet mud. But then I also got to thinking, if the zebras and the camels and the mammoth and the hippo fossils that we find are from the Ice Age, where are the fossils of the mammals that died in the flood? And this is when things really started getting me wondering. You know, the Bible talks about one great event that killed off the animals. Everything except for what was in the ark died. But yet when you have the Ice Age, we've got two events. We've got the flood that killed a lot of things, and then you've got the Ice Age that killed most of the mammals. And that started not making sense to me. And then I wondered, how did the Ice Age cause the extinction? Why didn't some just migrate and survive? Why did only the African camels and hippos and rhinos and zebras survive the Ice Age, but any of those in North America died? And that really started not making sense, especially as I found out that we've got camel fossils up in Alaska and hippo fossils all over the place. And zebras out there in Ash Falls, they had zebra fossils, but yet the horses we have in North America today are what the Spanish brought over to America. So how did all the zebras die off during the Ice Age with horses and everything else? That was one thing that really bothered me and got me thinking. So I wondered if all these Ice Age fossils couldn't really just be from the flood. And I know that's a new thought, but if you think about Mount St. Helens, 30 years after the mountain erupted and after the logs were or trees were washed into Spirit Lake, we still have a huge floating log mat. I took this picture during a helicopter ride over the lake. Now it's been 40 years. I'm anxious to see what the size of this log mat still is, but this was at the 30-year point. So if there were still this many logs floating on Spirit Lake 30 years later, just imagine how many logs and dead animals were floating on the floodwaters. The other thing to notice about these logs is how they're all grouped together. And as the wind blows, they blow about on the lake. So this huge mat just kind of drifts around on the lake. So imagine the volume of floating vegetation and carcasses there would have been upon the waters of the flood. And that's something that really doesn't get talked about very often. But if you think about it, the dead animals float. But what if things were buried where they were carried and not where they lived or grew? This is a tree that grew at the base of Mount St. Helens. It would have rode the landslide. I don't remember this for sure, but I think we're at least 10 miles away from the volcano at this point. So this tree rode the landslide to this area, and this is where it was stuck, where it stopped and where it was buried. But definitely it's not where it grew. And I'm wondering the same thing with the fossils. If it's where we find them isn't where they lived, it's just where they sank. And then there's the tar pits in Los Angeles. All right, when I read this one, I haven't been able to go and visit this area yet, but just reading about it, it's like, this would be so amazing to go and see. So I'm going to read this. The major pits average around 15 feet in diameter, and they taper down to a cone. Now, right there is kind of weird. What makes them taper into a cone? But then the bones are found entangled masses packed tightly together, dismembered and interlocking, with the majority that were damaged in some fashion. What packed these animals into these tar pits? Pit 36 had an opening of 4 feet by 2 feet. It's only 11 feet deep, yet it contains six carnivore fossils. How in the world do you squish 6 fossils into that small of a space? Now, I do believe it's something along the line of the animals coming along and getting trapped in the tar, but I can't say that for sure. I've not been there to read the signs, but tar wouldn't squish everything together. You would just kind of float down into it. But what if these were things that were floating on the water? And when the uplift started to happen and when the mountains were starting to be lifted, the mountains would stop and break the currents, just like when you have a stream and you put a big rock in the stream. It forms little eddies behind this rock. What if there were whirlpools that were formed that actually sucked down these animals and buried them into the sediment? That would be how they could be compressed all together, entangled all together, and just sucked down into the sediment. And then when their bodies rotted, you make your tar. So was it an ice age, or was it just winter during the flood? Now, many people say that the floodwaters were way too warm to freeze, and so they would have remained water. And that's true if the continents were on huge sliding plates that were sliding all over the place, producing frictional heat and having new ocean bottom rising up, and the volcanoes were erupting. But what if, this is going to be a really big what if, but just follow along. What if the pre-flood world had that canopy of water, huge land masses with lush vegetation, and a small shallow sea? And notice the granite that's underneath it all. So the magma is down below the granite, and then you have huge fountains of the deep that's embedded in the land there. So you don't have anything like you have today with a huge sea and small land masses. It's just the opposite. Small sea, huge land. With more land, that means there's plenty of room for more vegetation that would later become coal. And then the magma is down beneath all this creation rock granite. So God broke the fountains and he opened the windows and the flood began, and we had 40 days of water, but not lava. The rushing water pulverized the land and turned the land into sediment. So the continents, the land was totally gone as it was pulverized into sediment. We can see that at Mount St. Helens with the breached crater wall. This huge canyon was carved in just one day as the snow melted quickly there in the crater and went rushing over the top of the crater and carving this canyon. So fast flowing water can quickly grind rock into sediment. Now the spinning earth would have created globe circling currents, and this fast flowing water would then sort all this new sediment into the layers. Now, when you look at the early flood literature, they mention tides all the time, but they don't mention currents. And I wondered about that because it seems like you should have, the currents are so obvious today that you would have all those currents as well during the flood. But imagine if the continents were gone, those currents would be just circling the globe very quickly. But I wondered, why doesn't early flood literature, why does it only talk about tides? So doing a little bit of research, I found out that Matthew Murray, I knew he was the one who discovered the currents, but he made his discovery in the 1800s. So that early flood materials, they did not know about currents at the time. It was Matthew Murray that discovered the Gulf Stream and discovered the different currents on the world. So here we would be back during the flood. You'd have on the top of the flood waters all this floating vegetation and carcasses and some animals that are still swimming. in the floodwater, you would have all the sharks swimming about and feasting on these carcasses. And, you know, the interesting thing is all the places you can find shark's teeth all over the place. But then you'd have the buried vegetation in the animals. And buried in the layers were the animals that had days before roamed the earth, not indicating where they had lived, but where they had been carried and buried. So remember back at Mount St Helens, where the mountain became brand new dirt and things were buried where they were carried, but not where they had previously lived. Now the currents that would be circling the globe, they would be much stronger at the equator, excuse me, and slower at the poles, because at the equator, the earth is traveling at 1,000 miles per hour. But at the poles, it's going much slower than that. So all this floating carcasses and vegetation, they would have congregated towards the poles. And then when the floating material was beached on the land, as the land was raised, the vegetation and the flesh would decompose. And that's where you would get your rich soil, your muck, your tar, and the bones would be preserved. A lot of the bones would decompose as well. And that was another thing. Living here in Illinois and living in Michigan, you've got such rich black dirt soil. But I grew up in Florida and we spent a lot of time in Georgia, and you don't have it there. Down south, you've got sand and you have clay, but you don't have the rich soil. But that would have come from all the animals and floating trees and debris that was up north that then rotted. Now, let's talk about that the coral for just a minute. The coral that you can find up in Michigan and up in Canada and up in New York. Coral will quickly grow if there's a good food supply carried by a current. So if you've got the current going around, and all those decomposing animals would make a very good food supply. Coral would have thrived from pole to pole if, after the 40 days, yet before the plates all broke and started rising, the earth was encased by a warm, shallow, current-driven sea. So during the flood is where that coral would have grown, or when that coral would have grown. Now, sometime after the 40 days, the earth's crust broke. Again, this would have been an act of God. And the broken plates moved vertically, not horizontally slamming into each other and making mountains, but just vertically lifting up and the sea lifting down. And the water would drain off the land and back into the sea, which is what Psalms 104 seems to indicate, that God raised the land, lowered the sea, and the water drained back into the sea, and that's where it has stayed. So as the water drained into the deepening sea, that's where the secondary flood layers would come. Because as this water is draining off, it would be picking up all this mud, eroding it at some places, relaying it at other places. And that's also why you'd find so many broken fossils, because as it's being uplifted, eroded and relayed, the fossils would be breaking. And it's at this point that we have the lava. So the broken plates would have released the magma, and then you would have your different volcanoes going off. So where we have our mountain ranges, that's simply where God raised it higher, and the seas were raised lower, or sunk, sorry. And as you look at a map, that's like exactly what we see. The sea plates sank and the continents rose. You know, when they first came up with the ideas about all the sliding plates and whatnot, that was back when they thought the ocean floor was flat. But now they know there's as many mountain ranges on the ocean floor as there is on the land. And even the mid-Atlantic ridge, you know, that wasn't discovered until 1850. Murray, I just forgot his name, Matthew Murray. He's the one who discovered that as well. So just think, 100 years ago, scientists thought the ocean floor was flat, right? But we know now that it's not. So with the rising plates, that would produce minimal frictional heat. And the erupting volcanoes, that would just produce local heat. So it was the sun that kept the waters warm. And when you block the sun, there goes the heat. So with a year-long flood, both poles would experience winter. So I ask again, was there really an ice age, or was it just winter during the flood? Was there really an ice age, or has the ice just been building ever since the flood? I'm sure you all are aware of the World War II plains that were found in Greenland under 260 feet of ice. So in a little less than 50 years, 260 feet of ice accumulated on top of these World War II plains. That's an average of about 5 feet every year. So given that, we could easily build up to the snow and the ice and the glaciers that we have today just from the time of the flood. But it doesn't mean it had to build up and then melt back and then be building up again. Now, here's another interesting thing. This is an early map, and this map predates Columbus. And this map is accurate. Look at the continent there of Antarctica. It's an accurate shoreline, but it's a shoreline that's today cut under the ice sheets and you can't see it, but they know from radar or sonar what the shore looks like. And comparing it to these maps, they made accurate maps. Now, Solomon talks about sending fleets of ships and exploring the world. So right after the flood, and as people were scattering at the Tower of Babel, and as different people were setting out to explore this world, Antarctica was ice-free. And slowly, since the flood then, the ice has been building. Now, is there any biblical reason to believe in an ice age? A lot of people use the book of Job that talks about snow and ice and say, see, Job lived near the ice age. But Job could easily be talking about winter when you have snow and ice. But the main reason that I'm really leaning away from the ice age today, actually there's two reasons. One, biblically, is God promised Noah that there'd winter and summer and spring and fall, harvest and planting, it would be a cycle. And it would be a continuous cycle. And then also, but today, the ice age is being used to promote a lot of fear of climate change and believing in lots of different ice ages and look at all the extinctions that were caused in these previous ice ages. And oh no, we better be careful or we're going to cause a lot of extinctions again in the future if we don't control the climate. And on the fear goes. But the Bible talks about one extinction, and that was everything that lived on the land that was not in the ark, and it died. And I really don't see how the ice age extinction, it seems to take away from the flood extinction. The ice age is a step in the evolutionary ladder, and it's used today to promote evolutionary thought. We don't believe in the age of the dinosaurs, when there was a distinct set of animals that were dinosaurs. We know that the dinosaurs were created by God on day 6. They roamed and lived with man. They died during the flood, except for the ones saved on the ark. So why do we believe in a distinct group of animals that are ice age animals? Now, with evolutionary science, They don't have a global flood. That's the whole point, is trying to prove there was not a flood. So they have to have some other type of carving agent. So they use ice. Evolutionary science does not have flowing water to move the silt. So they use wind to move the silt. But flowing water does a far better job. We may be overlooking some of the best flood evidences by attributing them to an ice age. Are we actually throwing away evidence of the global flood by misinterpreting it as ice age? Are we missing the boat? The next generation needs the truth. This is back at Ash Falls. This is the one place for, it was at least 10 years. I had this on my list of a place I wanted to go, but we were never quite close enough to stop until finally on this one trip, we were close enough and we stopped at Ash Falls. But when I got there, it was more evolutionary than almost any other park we had been to, not just in promoting evolution, but actually mocking creation. The bookstore was full of books that just mocked creation and using the ice age. And so that was kind of the clincher for me, is just to make sure that we're not letting the world dismiss the fact of the flood by just saying, oh, the ice age did all this. All right, so that is pretty much the presentation. I hope I did not go too quickly through all that. So, but what now? Do I stop sharing the screen?
Well, you
Oh.
caught me a little bit off guard. I wasn't quite ready for you.
Yeah.
Sorry.
And I was scrambling to.
Myself together here and
Oh, okay.
Q&A.
I
If
might have
anybody
gone
has
a
any
little
questions
fast.
to post in the if anybody has any questions, you can post them into the chat, and also if you're watching on Facebook, you can put them in the comments there.
So that was really good, Carla. Except if in the chat, we got into discussion with Matthew on the La Brea Tar Pits. I was going to say La Tara Brea Pits, but the La Brea Tar Pits. Can you tie that together for us, what you were saying, what you think happened there?
Yeah, should I back up to it?
You can do that, or you can just explain what you think happened in greater detail.
Okay, I don't know if I could really go greater detail, but the main thing is with the tar pits, the fossils all being squished all tightly together. Okay, how is that really scientifically feasible for an animal to fall into a tar pit and get squished together with the other animals, compacted? And it's not like just the whole area is one an animal here, an animal there, an animal over here, but they're all entangled down into this tight little cone. Do you see what I'm saying? Does that?
So you think they swept in like because you are the first person to tread into that territory of floating bodies.
Say that one more time.
You're the first person to tread into the area of floating bodies.
I know, and it's
which is
frustrating.
Yeah, and
because
go ahead. I'm sorry.
It makes so much sense that, I mean, elephants are like one of the best swimmers. So for an elephant to swim, and oftentimes when they find baby elephants up on the trunk, not the trunk, the tusk of other animals, of other elephants. And you wouldn't find that if they were out on the land. But if they're swimming in the water and the baby gets tired, you could see the mama just scoops them up and carries them for a while. So I'm not really sure why more people don't talk about floating animals.
Yeah, and that's fine. I'm glad you broached that subject, because I've often thought about that. Because if you take a world full of animals and people and you flood it, and there's gonna be bodies.
Yes, and they're going to float.
Yeah.
It
And-
takes, yeah, even things that die and sink and stay sunk for a little while, then they float after. Anyways, I don't really like to think about it, but it's, yeah.
So you think because I know in LA or even in California, there's lots of oil there because there's a lot of, dead animal bodies.
Right.
That were buried there. But I think the contention we're having here on the La Brea Tar Pits is that there's actually like Native Americans that have been found in there. So maybe you just mean the area around the La Brea Tar Pits, or
Okay.
what?
How have they been? What do you mean by they've been Native Americans entangled with these other bones?
No, stuck in the muck of the La Brea Tar Pits. There's the La Brea Tar Pits actually have tar in them.
Right.
And in things of in recent post flood, post ice age, animals have gotten stuck in there, and they're finding that. Terry, you want to kind of sum up what Matthew's been posting?
No, does Matthew want to?
Matthew, do you want to step in here and help me out?
And he's saying that it's still happening.
Yeah,
Okay, well, if there's,
Okay, here he is.
okay, yeah.
So I want to be gracious, but it's just not really a discussion paleontologists would even have. Birds still get caught. They have to send rangers every now and then to rescue. A crow gets stuck, and all the tourists panic, and they have to go in and put hook some type of restraining device so the guy doesn't go in and die himself. You can go there and see all the pits. There's still tar bubbling up out of them. It's very recent. The oil, from a general perspective, the oil was formed during the flood. Oil is welling up long post-flood. All these species that are recent species, and nobody thinks that there were saber-toothed cats in the Ark. The modern synthesis of creationist biology is that there was an ancestral cat on the Ark. And from that ancestral cat, all the living species of cats we have now derived, lions and tigers and saber-toothed cats. There were no saber-toothed cats on the Ark. Saber-toothed cats are a post-flood species.
But why, if there were saber-toothed cats after the flood coming from the two that were on the Ark, why weren't there saber-toothed cats before the flood?
There were no saber-toothed cats on the Ark. There were ancestral cats on the Ark that didn't have saber teeth.
What I'm saying is, why were there no saber-toothed cats before the flood?
Because cats, well, one, we have a limited fossil record pre-flood. We don't have a lot of mammals, but the stuff that we have, looking at the post-flood record, the earliest cats we have are not saber-toothed animals. They're shorter-toothed animals.
There are species after the flood. There are species after the flood.
Right.
And
but I'm saying if there are species after the flood, why couldn't they also have been a species before the flood?
We never find any fossils of them before the flood. So.
And that's what I'm saying. Why? Maybe we never find any fossils of them before the flood because we aren't naming all the fossils from the flood as from the flood.
No, the dating is completely wrong. It's a common assumption of creation, of general, kind of street level, that all the dating is wrong. But every single creationist paleontologist I know would say the relative dating actually has value. In other words, if an evolutionist says, this fossil is 65 million years old, we're going to go, okay, that basically puts it generally towards the end of the depositional stage of the flood. And if an evolutionist says this fossil is 4 billion years old, we're going to say that's probably pushing it back more towards the beginning of creation week. They're relative, we don't think the Earth is millions or billions of years old, but the dating methods, you can actually get some relative idea. This thing is older than this thing. And the dates they're putting on the La Brea Tar Pits, it's like yesterday from a creationist perspective. It's way after the flood. It's way after Babel. It's a very recent event. When an evolutionist tells you this thing is less than 38,000 years old, when he says it's 10,000 years old, we're saying Noah and his descendants are still alive. Maybe they've left Babel, maybe they haven't. but it's a very recent thing. There's no way it's from the flood because it's not a sedimentary deposit. It is a predator trap. It's very clear. You know, you have all these herbivores getting stuck. Carnivores that are not fleeing from a flood. The carnivores are going, woohoo, here's a mammoth, it's stuck, I'm going to get it, and then they get stuck. They're getting buried. They're getting packed together after they die, after they rot away. You have the tar pits bubbling back up again and re-exhuming bones. It's a very well put together science. I mean, they're literally excavating it in front of your eye right now. You go to visit the museum, there are giant methane bubbles coming up in a pond out front of it. The tar pits are still there. Things, we would have tourists dying if you didn't have fences around them. From a creationist perspective, you know, the thing is, we don't have any evidence when you talk about like species deriving. You know, from a creationist perspective, all dogs go back to an ancestral dog kind, all cats go back to an ancestral cat kind. It's actually a way to test for flood, post-flood boundary to see if you have species before the flood. In other words, so you have two types of snakes, say a corn snake and a rat snake, which if I remember correctly, we think those are the same created kind. They're two different species now. And a friend of mine who's into herpetology did a paper on determining the flood, post-flood boundary via the use of snake fossils and other things, looking at kinds. So right now, if I look at the snakes around me, I've got corn snakes, I've got rat snakes. I'm like, okay, that's great, that's today. Now, if I go and dig in a fossil layer and I find corn snakes and rat snakes there, I can be pretty sure that that's post-flood because you're not going to have these two separate species pre-flood.
Okay.
Only one of them gets on the ark.
All right, hold on just a minute.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. If two snakes can become all the snakes that we have in the world today, then why couldn't there have been the same sorting of the genes before the flood to where there were lots of different types of snakes before the flood?
Actually,
well, let me clarify.
What? I can't quite catch everything that you're saying.
Actually, let me step in here real quick. So Jeff put an error in the comments here on Zoom. So he said that the pre-flood graves and animal burial sites would have been destroyed by the flood. The process of destruction during the flood would have been of cataclysmic proportion and tsunami forces to the extreme. So it's hard for us to be able, what he's saying, he's our in-house geologist. If I understand correctly, what he's saying is that that it's the fossils that we find are primarily post-flood fossils because anything before the flood would have been destroyed and spread to the point that we couldn't really find them. Am I understanding that correctly, Jeff?
Jeff, you can speak out. And Matthew, where I was listening, but I think the microphone that you're talking on is maybe not that great, or maybe you weren't close enough because you were kind of broken up. I mean, you were saying some very interesting things, but you were kind of hard to understand. and Alpha Rad is Jeff. He is our in-house geologist. So Jeff, if you've got something to say to help this out, go ahead.
Sure. Thank you. I wanted to say that, yes, any animals that would have been buried, or even people that would have been buried before the flood, if you've ever looked at any of the videos on YouTube from the tsunamis that hit Japan and Indonesia, from, even within the past 20 or 30 years, those things are very destructive. I wanted to correct the speaker when she said that water can carve rock. Well, that really isn't true. Rock isn't carved by water. What carves rock is water that contains sediment. It's the sediment grinding on the rock that actually carves the rock. And when you have a tsunami, what you're doing is you have a major wave action, a huge amount of energy in water. Water is not compressible, but what will happen is that wave energy will lift everything that's loose up into the water, and it has the effect of increasing the density of the water. And as it tries to release that energy, that water will flow and it will carry all that sediment. And the sediment is what grinds away everything that's underneath it. So,
Right, I would agree with that, except at Mount St. Helens, it was, at the beginning at least, it was still pure water. As the snow melted, that was water coming over the lip of Mount St. Helens crater.
okay.
So it was actually carving the rock. And then, of course, as it carved or pulverized the rock, that sediment mixed in with the water and it became a mud flow. And it kept on going down the mountain, carving even more. So,
Okay.
so
Well,
at the beginning,
when you say rock, though, are you talking about solid rock? Or are you talking about ash that's
No.
relatively soft?
No, it was the crater of the volcano. It was solid volcanic rock.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I'll tell you what, I will see you at Mount St. Helens. I'm
Oh,
planning on
good.
going on this trip, and we can
Okay.
discuss it at length then.
Well, that would be great.
I appreciate your comments, and you have some wonderful ideas. But I think there are some things that might bear some definition or some clarification.
Yeah.
When you talked about the snakes breeding, you talk about two snakes breeding every different kind of snake that there is on the earth. Between Adam's time and the flood, certainly there would have been genetic diversity, and we see that in the fossils. The Triceratops, they're the ceratopsian kind, which are all related to this Triceratops, and they all have similar forms, but they've found like 120 or 150 different skulls that all have their own nuances and their own varieties in them.
Right.
Now we know that they're all the same kind,
Right.
but there are genetic differences, and God allowed that when he created Adam and Eve and the pairs of the animals in the
Right.
garden.
Right. So what I'm saying is, just like we see all the different kinds with the dinosaurs, why couldn't that have happened with the cats as well?
What I was
To where there were saber-toothed cats on the earth before the flood.
what I'm saying is that can I be, am I
I
clearly?
can't hear you.
Matthew, we really want to hear you. If I don't know if you can talk closer to the microphone. But it's
How does this
it-
sound?
Say again.
Yeah, I've lost Matthew. I can't hear him.
Oh,
Yeah. Well, let's go ahead and move on to a different question then. We have a couple of questions from our Facebook comment feed. So one of them is, were the conical holes possibly created by the waters from the deep during the flood?
all right. Is that back at the tar pits again?
Nope, this is a different, I don't think that it is.
no.
She asked about the conical holes,
You talked about some
cone-shaped
conical
holes?
holes. Yeah.
were they
cone?
possibly created by the waters during the deep
Break up.
waters from the deep during the flood?
Yeah. See, the only thing I know about, no, because when the fountains of the deep erupted, then what the rock that they were erupting through would have all gotten eroded away. So I'm saying that the solid earth from before the flood was totally turned into sediment during the flood, down to the level where we have the Precambrian rock. That would be like the level it was scraped down to. And then the layers were laid on top of that. Does that make sense?
Okay.
So any, yeah.
I think it answers the question. So then we have another question that is asking if you could just clarify then, is what you're saying that the Ice Age was really the Great Flood?
Yes, I'm saying the hippos in England and the mammoths in Siberia, they were really things that floated up there on the waters of the flood, and they died during the flood. And the reason why today we only have hippos in Africa would be there was only 2 hippos on the ark, but there were millions, thousands at least, if not millions of hippos alive on the earth before the flood. So all of those hippos died and they were buried somewhere. but there was only 2 on the ark. And when those 2 got off the ark, they headed down towards Africa. Since hippos are a herding animal, they would stay together more. And they got down into Africa, and then that's where they stayed. And we don't find them anywhere else.
Is that could it be
So-
what happened with the kangaroo as well? I mean, this
Right.
is stuff I've not heard before, so I'm very interested.
Yeah,
And
that would be the same with anything that's a herd type animal that stays together. They would leave the ark, the pair would stay, grow into a family, grow a little bit more, and whichever direction they traveled, that's where we find them today. Now, things like elephants were very useful for people. So at the Tower of Babel, they were probably still using elephants. And when some people went off into India, they took elephants with them. And then elephants went into Africa. But like things that aren't herd animals, but they're more territorial animals, like your cats and your bears, they would have spread out and just kept spreading and spreading and spreading in all directions. So we can find bears down from South America through North America, the polar bear, and on into Europe. But hippos and other herd animals would basically go in one direction.
you know, I'm like I said, this is new territory for
Yeah,
us.
it's kind of,
And
yeah.
but in a way, it does. What I'm hearing you say is, after the flood, the animals that get off the ark were. That's why we only find hippos in Africa and kangaroos in Australia. Okay, yeah.
Yeah. And just like the Spanish brought horses here to America, I think when the people dispersed, they dispersed in ships as well, not just walking. But like the ones going to South America would have brought animals with them headed to South America. So those animals didn't have to travel across the land bridge and travel all the way through North America to get down to South America. They were could have just been brought there by the people.
Interesting.
Okay, so we have a couple more questions now in the Zoom chat. So Matthew is asking, Carla, how would you explain the striations on glacial erratics? And for that matter, how would you explain the lack of rounding on the glacial erratics?
Okay, so if they were coming from the flood, you've got at the end of the flood is the landslides were happening and the mud flows were happening, and you've got mountains that are being pushed up. Those mountains would also be being eroded down. So the rocks that broke off towards the very end of the flood, they wouldn't have been rounded as much. They would have stayed angular. But the ones that were deeper, the ones that traveled further, the ones that were in with the mud and the water the longest, they would get rounded off more. So it's just more of the time that they were traveling and when they were eroded off. Did that make sense?
Yes. And
Okay.
and then to add to that one, he also wants to know, how would you explain the medial, lateral, and terminal moraines?
Right.
We're getting our money's worth with you tonight.
Yeah.
We're giving you a run for your money.
Right. Well, the one thing that was interesting with these, okay, when you've got your lateral moraines, let's talk with that one first. And it's explained as like a bulldozer pushing through. It piles up dirt on either side of the bulldozer, right?
Yeah.
So the glaciers are pushing through and they're piling up dirt on either side of the glacier. But when we went up in New York, and one thing about me is I don't like interstates. I like back roads. And I really don't like paying tolls. So when we were traveling across,
Amen, sister.
and here was the long toll road that you could get, or there's another road practically paralleling it, which would be a scenic back road. And I said, well, why don't we take this road instead? And so we did. It happened to be across the Finger Lake area. So the reason they had a toll road is it was nice and flat. We went up and down, up and down, up and down all of these little hills, pulling a camper, and it wasn't fun. But when you go into a road cut and you look, there's flat layers in these road cuts. It's not just jumbled rock making these hills. And I don't know if I can explain that properly. If it really came from being bulldozed by a glacier, it would be a bunch of jumbled rock with sediment in there. It wouldn't have layers, but these have layers. So the only way that could have happened is the layers were all laid and then they were just carved through, and a mud flow will do that. As well as a glacier could do it, but so could a mud flow.
Well, that was pretty good. I understood it.
Makes sense? Okay,
Yeah.
okay.
Okay, so Carolyn is asking, can you outline the timeline of Antarctic map creation and how it became covered with ice?
Ooh.
Well, I don't know if that's going to fall into, but remember you were there for Stan and he was saying that at one point the Antarctic was not covered with ice, and
Right.
Carolyn had a lot of questions about. Carolyn's one of our regulars, and
Okay.
she's very interested in that.
Yeah, and I wasn't able to stay up late enough to hear all the question time with Stan. I basically, I do not know, but through the winter, each winter, more and more ice would have added to. In the summer, it melts off, but it doesn't all melt off. So the next winter, a little bit more gets added. Does that make sense?
Well, that makes
just, yeah, gradually. Like it would take like maybe 1,000 years if you add a foot, 5 feet a year that stays and doesn't melt off. So the next year it'd be like 10 feet. The next year it would be 15 feet.
I think we still have that going on, don't we?
Right.
Isn't that
We do.
Antarctic's growing? You know, I know the global alarmists say that. Actually, I had somebody on a meeting screaming about how Florida was going to be underwater because the glaciers were melting.
Yes.
But I believe that ice is being added to them. I think
Right.
they're increasing.
Yes. Now, some winters might not be as severe as others, so they might not get quite as much ice added to it. But the overall, it's more of a plus than it is a minus.
Good news.
Right?
Right.
I almost fell out of my chair when this professional person started screaming about Florida being underwater because the glaciers were melting. And I didn't want to mock his religion. So.
And see, that's the thing with all this climate change now. They're using the ice age to really promote a lot of fear in people. To see, look at all the things that died the last time climate change happened. And now it's about to happen again. And what's going to die this time? Yeah.
All right. Well, we're just about out of time here. And so Carla, thank you so much for coming tonight and presenting. I think you brought up some things that some people haven't really given much thought to so much. And so
a lot of new stuff.
Some new things, maybe a little controversial. I think you sparked some more questions and conversation than we're generally used to. So that's a little bit fun. So thanks for doing that, getting us thinking. So, but if you would like to tell people where they can find you, I guess, Robin, you took us off Facebook, but we're still recording for the other platforms. So yeah, if you want to tell people, Carla, about your ministry, your website, where people can find you.
Okay. Our website is called StonesTrueStory.org.
Okay.
So we tell the true story of the stones or the rocks and fossils. Yeah. And then email is the same thing, StonesTrueStory@gmail.com.
Okay, perfect. And then people can find our videos, of course, on YouTube at Creation Fellowship Santee and Rumble, CFS 2020, and we're adding them to BitChute as well. You can like and follow our Facebook page at Creation Fellowship Santee, and then you can also email us to get on our email list to get the links for upcoming and announcements for upcoming speakers. It's creationfellowshipsantee@gmail.com. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and sign off for the public part of this, the recorded video part of this.
I did want to
Okay,
mention
go
one
ahead.
other thing, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Okay, I've been writing a lot of this into different articles and whatnot, and they've been going on David Reeves' blog. His
Oh, do you write for David? Okay, he's a friend of our ministry too.
yeah.
Yeah.
So I think there's about 7 articles maybe up there now on his blog. So and basically most of what I've said tonight is in somewhere in an article.
Okay.
So if it's easier to read it than hear it.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then on Facebook, Terry, I'll post his blog.
Okay.
So people can go there. And I shut Facebook off by accident. I'm working a couple computers here, and normally it's Terry who does the Facebook thing. I jumped the gun, so.
That's okay. But we can go ahead and turn the recording off now. And then if people want to turn on their cameras and thank Carla, and we could ask her to pray to close us.